So it's the way the books were written. Those 12 and 12 was written to support the big book, the essays. So this is going to be a full-blown out seminar. And this is the first time in New York this has ever been done. They do them in Florida and the West Coast, and I don't know where else, but some other places. Introduce two friends of mine who changed my life, Joe and Charlie.
Thank you, Bill. My name is Joe, and I'm an alcoholic. And I'm a little flush right now, so forgive me. I'll cool down here in a little bit. But it's truly by God's grace and the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that comes from a book called Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm sober today, and for that I'm very, very thankful. And I've been sober ever since I could remember. Thank you. I generally tell a little story about this time, but I was kind of flush a while ago, and I ran to the restroom, and a lady tapped me on the shoulder. She said, "Are you Joe or Joe and Charlie?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "Are you nervous?" I said, "No, not really." She said, "Well, you're in the ladies' restroom." So maybe I'll get settled down here in a minute and we'll get underway.
Morning, everybody. My name is Charlie Fireman. I'm a very grateful recovering alcoholic.
Hi, Charlie.
Because I'm a member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and by the grace of the power that I found through the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I haven't found it necessary to take a drink for 12,686 days today, one day at a time. And for this, I'm very, very grateful. You guys look great this morning. Joe leaned over here a while ago and he said, "Charlie, this is the best looking bunch of sick people we've seen in a long time, isn't it?" Yeah. We always do like to start off with a little joke or a little story just to kind of get some humor going. The one I love to tell, some of you have heard it before, but I love it. It's about the brain surgeon. And this brain surgeon had developed a way to transplant the human brain in its entirety. Been doing it for years with the other organs of the body. He found a way to do it with the brain. This older fellow went to see him and he said, "Doc, I've been having a problem with my brain. I can't think anymore and can't reason things out and can't remember anything. Can you help me?" And the surgeon said, "Well, let's give you a good physical examination and see what kind of shape your body's in first." So he gives him a good physical exam, and he said, "Oh, yeah, your body's in great shape." He said, "I believe I could transplant this brain into your head, and everything would be okay." The old man said, "Well, great. What do you have to offer?" The surgeon said, "Let's go up in the display room, and I'll show you what we've got in stock at the present time." He went up in the display room, and he said, "In this case over here, I have the brains of an attorney." He said, "I could transplant this in your head. Everything would be fine. It'll cost you $20,000. The old man said, "Well, do you have anything else?" And he said, "Oh, yeah. In this case over here, I have the brains of a doctor." He said, "I could transplant this in your head. Everything would be great. It'll cost you $50,000. The old man said, "Well, do you have anything else?" And he said, "Oh, yeah. In this case over here, I have the brains of an alcoholic." He said, "I could transplant this in your head. Everything would be great. Cost you $100,000. The old man said, "I don't understand this deal. $20,000 for the attorney's brain, $50,000 for a doctor's brain, and $100,000 for an alcoholic's brain?" Doctor said, "Well, hell yes, man. It's brand new. It's never been used before." I think most of us will go to the grave with about 50,000 miles left on the original warranty that we probably never did touch. So. We always like to say as we start one of these, we do not consider ourselves to be the gurus of the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. We don't consider ourselves to be the experts on anything at all, period. We're just two old drunks, met together several years ago, found we have a mutual interest in the big book, studied it together for quite some time. Hopefully we've learned a few things about it. And those few things we've learned about it, we just love to be able to share them with other people. We do not attempt to speak for AA as a whole, and you are most certainly free to agree or disagree with anything that we say throughout the entire weekend as you see fit. In fact, if you hear us saying things that can't be reconciled with what's in the big book, we suggest you just don't pay any attention to those things at all. And we'll try to keep most of our comments centered on the book itself. We believe our book when it says we are meant to be joyous, happy, and free. Joe and I we love to have a good time. We love to laugh. We love to cut up. We love to tell jokes. We love to hear other people laugh also. From time to time throughout the weekend, we may stop whatever we're doing, tell a little joke just to get some humor started. And if we tell one and it isn't funny, we'll go ahead and laugh anyhow. It'll make you feel better, make the one next to you feel better, make us feel better also. We fully and completely realize that the mind will only absorb what the rear end will stand. And some of these sessions do become quite long. And if you feel the need to get up and move around during one of them, please feel free to do so. It won't bother us at all. If you feel the need to go out and get a cup of coffee, smoke a cigarette, please feel free to do that. It's not going to bother us at all. Or if you feel the need to go get rid of a cup of coffee, please feel free to do that also. No sense in sitting there suffering in silence. We will take a little break periodically as we go through this thing, but most of the sessions are going to be quite long. Now, if we're going to study the big book and talk about the book, which of course is what we're here for this weekend, I think we need to look at just a little bit of the history behind the book, not very much, but a little bit, in order to be able to see what happened to some of the original people that started this thing in the first place. And being able to see those things about Bill and Bob and some of the others, it'll make it easier for us to understand the book itself as we go through it. So if you guys are ready, we are too. Let's go to the foreword to the second edition, and we'll talk just a little bit about the history of the big book. Roman numeral 15.
There's one thing that Bill did that if you kind of get the idea of how he wrote, that it would help you in reading Bill's writings anywhere that you see Bill's writings. Number one, he always tells us what the problem is. Number two, he'll give us a solution to that problem. And number three, he'll give us a practical program of action to implement the solution that he just described. He does that over and over and over and over in all of his writings. And keeping that in mind, it helps me to read Bill's writings and understand what he's trying to do. So on the bottom of the page, Roman numeral page 15, it says, the spark that was to flare in the first AA group was struck at Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician.
I think we're treating old Bill pretty good when we call him a New York stockbroker. He really wasn't. He was a New York City stock speculator. He made his living out of selling fast talking to slow-thinking people. We don't want to take anything away from Bill. He was a great man. But we all need to realize he's a real alcoholic, just like all the rest of us. And understanding that, it makes it easier to understand the book, because, of course, Bill is the primary author of the book. The Akron physician is this fellow named Dr. Bob Smith.
6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend who'd been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day.
As we get into Bill's story, we're going to be able to see that Bill had in the town's hospital what he always referred to as a vital spiritual experience. But prior to that, Bill had to learn a few things in order to be able to have that spiritual experience. And one of the things that happened to him, this old friend, an old school friend from his old school days, an old drinking buddy named Debbie Thatcher, came to visit with Bill in Bill's kitchen. And he gave Bill what turned out to be two vital pieces of information. Debbie said to Bill that people like you and I that have become absolutely powerless over alcohol, if we're going to recover from that condition, we're going to have the aid of a power greater than human power. And he said, I've been attending meetings with a group of people called the Oxford Groupers, and they told me that if I could have a vital spiritual experience, that during that experience I would find the power greater than human power, and I would be able to recover from alcoholism. He said they also told me or gave me a practical program of action, and they guaranteed me if I would follow that program of action, I would have the spiritual experience and I would find the power greater than human power. And he said, look at me, Bill. It's been 2 months since I've had a drink. And Bill knew about Ebby Thatcher. And he knew how Ebby Thatcher drank. And he knew that if Ebby has been sober for 2 months, some power greater than Ebby had to be working in Ebby's life. So Ebby gave Bill 2 pieces of information there. First, he gave him the solution to alcoholism, the vital spiritual experience during which we find the power greater than human power. And he also gave him the practical program of action necessary to find or have that spiritual experience. So 2 of the things that Bill needed to know in order to recover came to him from Ebby Thatcher through the Oxford groups.
He said he's also been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism, who is now kind of no less than a medical saint by AA members, and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. From this doctor, the broker learned the grave nature of alcoholism. And again, we're going to see as we get into Bill's story, where Bill was placed in the Towns Hospital here in New York City in the summer of 1933 to be withdrawn from alcohol by Dr. Silkworth. And after Silky withdrew Bill, he got to where he could think a little bit and listen. Silky sat down with him and gave him his ideas about this thing called alcoholism. And he said, Bill, I do not believe that alcoholism is a matter of willpower. I don't believe it's moral character. And I don't think sin has anything to do with it at all. He said, I believe people like you are suffering from an illness. And he said it's a very peculiar illness. It seems to be a 2-fold illness, an illness of the body as well as an illness of the mind. And he said, I believe people like you have developed what we refer to as a physical allergy to alcohol. He said, it seems to me as though any time people like you take any alcohol whatsoever into their system, that it produces an actual physical craving which demands more of the same. And he said that physical craving is so strong that after you once take a drink and the craving develops, you're unable to control the amount you're going to drink, and you end up drunk and sick and in all kinds of trouble over and over and over. But he said that's only half of your problem. He said, I also believe people like you have developed what we call an obsession of the mind. And he said an obsession of the mind is an idea that overcomes all ideas to the contrary. And he said it doesn't really make any difference how badly you want to stop drinking. Doesn't make any difference how hard you apply your willpower. From time to time, the obsession of the mind is going to tell you that it's okay to drink. And then you're going to take a drink and you're going to trigger the allergy and the craving is going to develop and you'll end up drunk and sick over and over and over again. He said, Bill, you can't safely drink because of the physical allergy of the body, nor can you keep from drinking because of the obsession of the mind. And he said, if you can't drink without getting drunk, and if you can't keep from drinking, then you've become absolutely powerless over alcohol. And for the first time in his life, in the summer of 1933, Bill Wilson understood what his problem was. But we know that that was not sufficient for him to recover from alcoholism, because he started drinking again shortly thereafter. The summer of 1934, he's back in the Towns Hospital again. This time, Silkworth pronounced him as incurable. Bill left the hospital in summer of 34, and he said fear sobered him up for a bit. But then the obsession of the mind told him it's okay to drink. And on Armistice Day, 1934, he took a drink and he was off and running again. So knowing the problem was not enough to recover. It was necessary for him to know a solution and a program of action. And that's what Ebby Thatcher brought to him in the latter part of November of 1934. Now then, Bill knew all 3 things. He knew the problem, he knew the solution, he knew the program of action, and sure enough, through the program of action, he had a vital spiritual experience and had recovered from alcoholism. Ebby began to take Bill to these Oxford group meetings, and our book says though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford groups, he was convinced of the need of moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of, belief in, and dependence upon God, which were the tenets of the Oxford Group, which later on were expanded into the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, now prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic, but he succeeded only in keeping sober himself. Bill liked the idea of helping other people, so he began to start around trying to help other people, running up and down the streets of New York City, sending some of those drunks up out of the gutter, taking them to the Oxford Group meetings, going into some of those bars down there and taking them off the bar stool and taking them to the Oxford Group meetings. Most of them didn't want to go, but Bill was taking them anyhow because they helping him stay sober. And after a while, Bill went to Lois and said, Lois, I don't think that anybody's wants what I have. And said, well, Bill, obviously what you're trying to do helping those other people is helping you stay sober. Said, why don't you talk to Dr. Silkworth about this? So we went to see Dr. Silkworth and told him, said, look, I've been trying to help those drunks stay sober and nobody seems to want what I have. And he said, well, yeah, Bill, we've heard a lot about what's going on with you and those drunks. You're trying to cram that great spiritual experience down their throat and they just won't buy it. They just won't buy it. He said, why don't you do for them what I did for you? Why don't you talk to them about the illness of alcoholism? Talk to them about the physical allergy and the possession of the mind and how that worked with you. And if they'll accept that, then maybe you can talk to them about those spiritual experiences.
He said, Bill, every alcoholic I know has two questions. Number one, why can't I drink like I used to without getting drunk? And number two, why can't I stay sober now that I want to stay sober? And he said, if you will explain to them the exact nature of the illness, explain to them the physical allergy, the obsession of the mind, you'll get their attention. And he said, after you get their attention, then you can talk to them about spirituality. But he said, don't start with spirituality. Explain to them what the problem really is. And we don't think it's by accident that the very next person Bill talked to happened to be Dr. Bob when Bill was there on a business visit in Akron, Ohio.
The broker had gone to Akron on a business venture which had been collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might drink again. He suddenly realized in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician. Bill went there to engage in a proxy fight, take over a company called the Akron Tool and Machine Company, a really nice company there in Akron. But his proxy fight failed. And now he finds himself in the Mayflower Hotel, walking back and forth, pacing, wondering what he's going to do. He didn't have but $10 in his pocket, not enough money to pay his hotel bill, not enough money to get back home on, so he was concerned about what he was going to do. And Bill said, I think I'll go in the bar there and engage in a little conversation, a little vicarious thrill, maybe have a Coke and visit with some people. He said, no, if I go in there, I'll drink again. He said, I better find me another drunk to work with. And I just think about that all the time. We in AA, at least I do. I think about Bill walking up and down in the hallway there. Do I go in there and have a drink, or do I go over here and help a drunk? If it had been up to me, we wouldn't be sitting here today. But Bill was a kind of fellow who decided he would go help a drunk rather than go in the bar. See, we won't talk about seconds and inches in AA. Just a few seconds that way, a few inches over that way. That's all we really got to talk about. And Bill made a decision there. Either do that or do that.
I think what's so important here is Bill remembered how back in New York City that even though he had never been able to help another alcoholic, that every time he had tried, he himself had felt better. So he said to himself, if I'm going to keep from taking a drink, I better find me another drunk to work with. And we know that he made a few phone calls. We know that eventually he was put in contact with Henrietta Seiberling. She in turn sets him up with a visit with Dr. Bob.
This physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but it failed. They'd been talking to Dr. Bob at this Oxford group in Akron about his drinking. In fact, they'd prayed that maybe Dr. Bob would find a solution for his drinking problem. So when Bill got a hold of Henrietta Seiberling, there was no surprise to her. She thought it was the answer to their prayers because they'd been praying for a solution for Dr. Bob. The broker then gave Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism as hopelessness. the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. He sobered never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. Henrietta called Ann Smith and said, Ann, I think we got an answer to our prayers. We've got this fellow from New York who seems to have a solution for alcoholism. Bring Dr. Bob over, and we'll introduce them, and maybe Dr. Bob and Bill, maybe Bill can help this Dr. Bob. So, well, Ann, I'm sorry, but Ann said, I'm sorry, Henrietta, I can't bring him over today. You know, today is the day before Mother's Day, and he's brought me a potted plant. And as a matter of fact, he's potted underneath the table there right now. He said, well, bring him over tomorrow. So the next morning, Ann starts getting Dr. Bob ready to go see this fellow named Bill. And she said, we're going to go meet this fellow named Bill. And he said, I'm not going. I've got a hangover. I feel too bad. I'm not going over there. She said, oh, yes, you are. And he said, no, I'm not. Well, you know how that goes. Finally, he said, okay, all right, I'll go, but I feel too bad. I'll say 15 minutes, no more. That's all the time I'm going to give this fella. So he went over there and met Bill. They went off in another room, and Bill began to do something different that he hadn't done before.
We got some here.
This time he said,
We got some.
He didn't talk to Dr. Bob about Dr. Bob's drinking. He talked to Dr. Bob about Bill's drinking, and Bill began to identify with what Dr. Bob began to identify what Bill had to say. And this identification is very, very important, as we well know in AA. And he was to stay there with him for the next 5.5 hours. Later on, he said in some of his writings, I intend to go over there for 15 minutes. But here's the first man that I'd ever known who knew about alcoholism. And he was able to help me with that information.
You know, this seemed to prove two things. Number one, that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. For the first time, in talking to another alcoholic, Bill told his story. He didn't talk about Dr. Bob's drinking, he talked about Bill's drinking. He talked about the physical allergy that Silkworth had told him about. He talked about the obsession of the mind that Silkworth had told him about. And for the first time, Dr. Bob could see his problem. Now, he already knew the solution. He already knew the program of action, but he'd never been able to apply it to the depth necessary to recover because he didn't know what was wrong with him. He thought it was weak will. He thought it was moral character. He thought it was sin. Why would he not? That's what everybody had told him up until that time. But when Bill told him about what Dr. Silkworth had to say, for the first time, Dr. Bob could see his problem. One alcoholic identifying with another alcoholic. It also seemed to prove that necessary for recovery is one alcoholic working with another. You know, the very two things that our whole fellowship is really built upon. One alcoholic sharing with another helps the other person, plus at the same time it helps us stay sober. Dr. Bob now knew all three things. He applied the program of action. He recovered from alcoholism. That makes two people now in the summer of 1935 in Akron that know three things. What is the problem? What is the solution? What is the program of action? Immediately, they knew in order to keep this thing, they're going to have to give it away. This came out of the Oxford Group program. So they immediately began to think about working with another alcoholic. Dr. Bob called down to the hospital, talked to the head nurse, and said, I've got a guy here from New York City that seems to know what he's talking about when it comes to alcoholism, and maybe we have a method of recovery. Do you have anybody there we can talk to? And she said, oh, yeah. I said, we've got a corker in here. He just blacked the eyes of both eyes of one of the nurses. We've got him strapped down in here in the ward. And Dr. Bob said, we'll put him in a private room, and we'll be down there in the morning to talk to him. So they go down the next morning, and they talk to this fellow. His name is Bill Dotson. We see the picture in AA rooms all over the world called The Man on the Bed. The first paragraph on Roman numeral 17. Hence, the two men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics, arriving in the ward of the Akron City Hospital. Their very first case, a desperate one, recovered immediately and became AA number 3. They sat down with Bill Dotson, and they didn't talk to Bill Dotson about Bill Dotson's drinking. They talked to him about their own drinking. And through the sharing of their stories, for the first time, Bill Dotson could see his problem. He could see the physical allergy. He could see the obsession of the mind. He always thought it was weak will, moral character, and sin. Why would he not? That's what everybody had told him before. But for the first time, through the sharing of the stories, these guys let him see what his problem really is. Then they talked to him about spirituality. Then they talked to him about the program of action. And a couple of days later, Bill Dotson told his wife, said, "Get my clothes out of the closet, I'm going home." And he got up, dressed, went home, applied the program of action, and had a spiritual experience and recovered from alcoholism. Now we got 3 of them. He said this work at Akron continued through the summer of 1935. There were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. You know, in the summer of 1935, with these 3 guys sober, no, they really didn't know what they were doing. About everything they did was on a trial and error method. They would try something, and if it worked, they would retain it. If it didn't work, they would discard it. They tried many, many things in working with alcoholics in the summer of 1935 there in Akron. One of Dr. Bob's favorite things was to fill them up with sauerkraut juice mixed with Karo syrup. The sauerkraut juice had the vitamins necessary to help the body. The Karo syrup made it possible for him to be able to drink the damn stuff, you know. And every once in a while, one of these guys would fall over dead. And I'd almost see Bill turn to Bob and say, "My God, let's don't try that again," you know. So sometimes I think we always give credit to Bill and Bob in the first 100. But sometimes I think we ought to stop and give credit to those that they worked with and failed with during the summer of 1935. They probably learned more from the failures than they did from their successes. When the broker returned to New York in the fall of 1935, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at that time. You know, there was no AA in those days. What Bill left behind him was a few alcoholics who were members of the Oxford group. Now, the Oxford groupers and the alcoholics began to have some difficulties from the very beginning. The alcoholics, they like to go to the Oxford group meetings, smoke cigarettes, drink coffee, tell dirty stories, drop ashes on the floor, and the Oxford groups were not too particularly crazy about that. The Oxford groupers really were not in the business of alcoholism anyhow. Their idea was to help the more elite members of society. They wanted to be able to help the mayor of the town and the governor of the state, and et cetera, and et cetera. So there was always some friction. The Oxford groupers had a thing they called the 4 absolutes, where you practice absolute love, absolute honesty, absolute purity, and absolute unselfishness. The alcoholics were having a hell of a time being absolute anything except alcoholics. So to separate themselves from the Oxford groupers, they called themselves the drunk squad of the Oxford group. That's what Bill left behind him when he came back to New York City. He came back to New York City, and now he began to try here the same thing that he had done with Dr. Bob. He got hold of a drunk here, and he didn't talk to him about spirituality. He sat down and shared his story and told him about the exact nature of his illness. And sure enough, an alcoholic here in New York City bought into that. Then Bill told him about spirituality and the program of action, and the next thing you know, an alcoholic in New York City had recovered too, and another, and another, and another. Now, by a second small group had promptly taken shape at New York, and besides, there were scattered alcoholics who had picked up the basic ideas in Akron or New York and were trying to form groups in other cities. Slowly, it began to spread. Now, in 1937, Bill was back in Akron, again on a business venture, and he stopped by and visited with Dr. Bob. And they sat down and they counted the number of people that they knew were staying sober on these 3 little pieces of information. A few of them in Akron, a few here in New York City. A little group had started up in Cleveland, and various 1s and 2s, and they found they had about 40 people staying sober. And I think for the first time, they began to realize that maybe we do have the answer to this thing called alcoholism. And if we've got the answer to it, then what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do with this information? Are we going to franchise it and keep it for ourselves? Are we going to say 40's enough, we don't need any more? But always coming out of the Oxford groups is this idea, if you're going to keep it, you're going to have to give it away. So the question really becomes then, if we're going to give it away, how can we do this? How can we carry this information to the greatest number of people? Now maybe this is the beginning of the group conscience, because Bill and Bob decided they didn't want to make that decision. And they called a meeting there in Akron, Ohio, of the Oxford groupers. And there was about 18 people at that meeting, not all of them alcoholic. And the topic of the discussion is how can we carry this information to the greatest number of alcoholics throughout the United States, Canada, really the entire world. And during that meeting, they made 3 decisions. Number 1, they decided they needed to build a chain of hospitals. Now, this is in the middle of the Depression. Nobody has a dime. But we're going to build this chain of hospitals stretching all the way across the United States, where any alcoholic can go in for detox. I assume Dr. Bob was probably going to be the head doctor of the hospitals. They also said this information is so important. Already we're beginning to see it being changed as people try to carry it by word of mouth one to another. So what we need to do is hire and train a group of professionals, and they'll go out and spread across the country and carry this great message to other alcoholics. And then finally somebody said, well, if it's being changed by carrying it by word of mouth, maybe we ought to put it down in a written form. Maybe we ought to write a book about alcoholism. You know, back in the 1930s, books were very, very popular. People did a lot of reading in those days. That was in the days before television. And believe me, there really was a time before television. There really was. And the Oxford groups, the groupers had written several spiritual books, and they sold quite good. And they said, well, you know, if we could write a book on alcoholism and tell people what alcoholism really is and tell people how to recover from alcoholism, then surely it would become one of the world's best sellers, and we could sell that book and take the profits from it, and we could build the hospitals and hire and train the missionaries with the profits from the book. That was one of the reasons that they decided to write it. But the main reason is that if we're going to keep this message pure, we're going to have it in the written form. Because if we keep carrying it by word of mouth, it will eventually become so garbled that it will be meaningless. Now, thank God they decided to write the book, but thank God it didn't sell very good in the beginning, and they didn't get to build the hospitals, and they didn't get to hire and train the missionaries, but they did get to put down their information about alcoholism and how to recover from it in the written form. It tells me here in the book, says, it was now time the struggling groups thought to place their message and unique experience before the world. And this determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women. From 37 to 39, the membership had gone from 40 to 100. The fledgling society, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. So in 1939, when the big book was published, we had 2 Alcoholics Anonymouses. We had a book called Alcoholics Anonymous. And in that book, Alcoholics Anonymous, the first 100 men and women had taken their knowledge about alcoholism, put it down in the written form, telling people what the problem really is, telling people what the solution to that problem is, and giving a program of action necessary to recover from that condition. Now, the little society, which had been nameless, members of the Oxford groupers, now began to call themselves Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of the book. So we had 2 Alcoholics Anonymouses. One, a book containing a program of recovery from alcoholism. One, a small group of people who had taken their knowledge, who had practiced these things in that book, and they had recovered from alcoholism. And in 1939, there was no quarrel between the program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous and the program in the fellowship Alcoholics Anonymous. They were identical as far as the program is concerned. The book began to go out across the country. Now, somebody out in California got a copy of the book Alcoholics Anonymous, read it, studied it, did what it said to do, and recovered from alcoholism, and started an AA group in California. Same thing happened in Texas. Same thing happened in Florida. The same thing happened in Missouri. And it began to happen all across the country. Alcoholics would get a copy of this book, read it, study it, do what it said, recover from alcoholism, and start an AA group. So the great growth of the fellowship began to come from the message contained in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And in the beginning, the program in the book was the same as that in the fellowship. But then as time went by, they began to notice something that the first 100 didn't have. They begin to notice the great power and strength that comes from large numbers of people gathering together, solving the common problem. And they begin to say to themselves, well, you know, do we really need to do everything this book says to do? Is it going to really be necessary to turn our entire will and life over to the care of God as we understand Him? Couldn't we just give Him the alcohol and we'll keep the rest? Mm-hmm. They begin to say, you mean we got to share everything with another human being? God already knows about it. We know about it. Why tell somebody else about it? They begin to say, you mean we got to get rid of all of our character defects? How in the hell are we going to make a living if we do that? And they begin to say, well, maybe we don't need to do everything that book says to do. You know, maybe we could take some and leave some and still be able to stay sober. And when they did that, we went from a life-changing program into a non-drinking program. And people began to concentrate more on sobriety than they did on the quality of that sobriety. And slowly, over a period of time, the program and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous began to change. And then came the great advent of the treatment centers. Now, please don't get us wrong. We got nothing against treatment centers. They serve a worthwhile purpose. But in treatment centers, they're not going to be able to survive in a treatment center atmosphere just by studying the book Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, in order to be able to charge the fees that they charge and et cetera, they're going to have to be other stuff also. And we begin to see lots of money coming into the field of alcoholism. We begin to see people in the psychiatric and psychological professions going into the treatment center business, and we begin to hear terms coming out of treatment into AA that we had never had before. We begin to hear people talking about chemical dependency. You know, we'd never talked about that before. We always talked about alcoholism. We begin to hear people talking about dual addiction. We begin to hear people talking about polyaddiction. We begin to hear people talking about dysfunctional families. We begin to hear people talking about dysfunctional sex. We begin to hear people talking about everything in AA except what's in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Until today, you go to some AA meetings, and if they didn't read the preamble before the meeting, you wouldn't know what kind of meeting you're in. Well, they talk about everything except alcoholism and recovery therefrom. You know, we call those group depression meetings. You go in there feeling pretty good. Hell, halfway through the meeting, you might as well just blow your brains out. There's no sense in living at all. So what we're going to try to talk about this weekend is not the program in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. We're going to try to talk about the program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And thank God, the program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous has never been changed. It's the same today as it was in 1939 when the big books was first published. And just maybe if enough of us start talking about the program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, maybe we can begin to change the program in the fellowship Alcoholics Anonymous. Maybe we can get back to original, fundamental, basic AA recovery stuff coming out of the big book, Joe?
Let's go to Roman numeral page 19. By the way, I feel better.
Good.
I think I'm going to make it now. The last line. This is the kind of success they were having when the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous was one and the same. So while the internal difficulties of our adolescent period were being ironed out, public acceptance of AA grew by leaps and bounds. For this, there were two principal reasons: the large number of recoveries and reunited homes. These made their impressions everywhere. Of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried, 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered up after some relapses, and among the remainder, those who stayed on with AA showed improvement. Other thousands came to a few AA meetings at first decided they didn't want the program, but great numbers of these, about 2 out of 3, began to return as time passed. If my math is correct, that's 75% of those people who came to AA and really tried stayed sober. Today, we can't even fantasize about 75% recovery rate in Alcoholics Anonymous. Can't even talk about 25%. Can't even talk about 10%, really. It's less than that, 5% maybe. And I think the reason for that being is that people, Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, got away from the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that's in the book called Alcoholics Anonymous. And our problem today is try to get back to the basics of Alcoholics Anonymous. And there's a little problem here, a little book pamphlet here called Problems Other Than Alcoholism, which was written by Bill Wilson and published in 1958. Very interesting. I think everybody in AA ought to read one of these pamphlets. But here on the third page, it says sobriety, freedom from alcohol, through the teaching and practice of the 12 steps, is the sole purpose of an AA group. That's the only reason to have an AA group, through the practice and teaching of the 12 steps. And the question we always ask is your group practicing teaching of the 12 steps? If not, I don't know what kind of meeting we're going to. But that's the sole purpose of an AA group, the practice and teaching of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Okay, now we're not going to preach anymore.
Yeah.
That's all the preaching we're going to do.
Hope you don't believe that.
Now that we know a little something about the history of the book, let's go to the table of contents, begin to look at the layout of the book. Let's see if we can't see where they took the information they had and laid it out in basically the same sequence that the first 100 had to know in order to recover from alcoholism. You know, Bill couldn't recover from alcoholism until he knew the problem. He got that from Silkworth. Abby then brought him the solution, the Vital Spirits experience, and he brought him the program of action out of the Oxford groups. He went to see Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob already knew the solution and the program of action, but he didn't know the problem. So Bill had to explain to him the problem. And then Dr. Bob could recover. They went to see Bill Dotson, and they told Bill Dotson 3 things. What is the problem, what is the solution, and what is the program of action necessary to recover? When they decided to write the book, they decided to take this same identical information and put it down in that same sequence that they had to know in order to recover from alcoholism. So as we discuss the big book this weekend, we're going to be looking basically for 3 main goals or 3 main purposes. We're going to be looking for the problem, we're going to be looking for the solution, and we're going to be looking for the program of action necessary to be able to recover from that problem. And we're going to find in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous that the doctor's opinion and Bill's story basically will tell us what the problem really is. Some of it will be in chapter 2 and 3, but most of it in the doctor's opinion and Bill's story. Also, we're going to be able to see through the doctor's opinion and Bill's story all the information necessary to be able for us to accept step 1, where we can admit we're powerless over alcohol and our lives have become unmanageable, just as Bill's did and just as Dr. Silkworth talks about in the doctor's opinion. So we should be able to see everything we need for step 1. through the doctor's opinion and Bill's story. Now, through that, we're going to be able to see where we are powerless over alcohol. And if we are powerless, then obviously the answer is going to lie within power. And in chapters 2, 3, and 4, we're going to be talking about a power greater than human power that can restore us to sanity. In chapter 2, it tells us what the solution really is. The power of the fellowship that supports us, the power of the vital spiritual experience which changes us. In chapter 3, it's going to tell us what's going to happen to us if we don't find that power because of our insanity. In chapter 4, it's going to give us some new ideas about that power, so we'll be able to start making a decision concerning that power. So all the information we need for step 2, we're going to be able to find in chapters 2, 3, and 4. Now, if we're powerless, and if the answer lies within power, then the next thing we've got to know is how do we find that power? And we're going to find a program of action in chapters 5, 6, and 7. And that program of action will be the last 10 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, 3 through 12. And if we apply those action steps in our lives, we're going to be able to find that power, and we're going to be able to recover from alcoholism. So when you start looking at the big book in this manner, in the sequence in which it is written, it becomes a very, very fascinating thing. When I first got a hold of the book, I read it as you read a novel. I would read a little bit of something in chapter 2. Well, I didn't like what it had to say. So I'd leave that and I'd go to one of the stories in the back of the book. And then I'd come back and I'd read a little bit in chapter 4. Well, I sure as hell didn't like that. And then I'd go read something and I just read it back and forth, skipped around. But if we read it as a textbook, which is presented to us in a certain sequence, conveying ideas from their minds to ours, then we're going to be able to see that each chapter leads directly into the next chapter. In fact, we're going to find as we go through it, each paragraph leads directly into the next paragraph. If studied in sequence, then we're going to learn these 3 things that the first 100 had to know. We're going to learn the problem, the solution, and the program of action. You know, I get amused at people today. They say they're going to a step study meeting. They're always referring to the 12 and 12 as a step study meeting. But anytime you're studying in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous, anywhere in the first 164 pages, you're going to be studying the steps because they're in there presented in that particular sequence. Joe?
And I like the way the book's laid out. When I owned a company, I owned a printing company that published books like this and others. And I have sat in on many, many meetings where they were laying out a book. And when I got to this book, I thought, well, what do a bunch of old drunks know about laying out a book, you know? So I didn't think this book was laid out in any particular rhyme or reason to it. But as I began to read and study the big book, I began to see some things in there. As Charlie said, that the problem is explained in the doctor's opinion, Bill's story. Bill's first experience with staying sober was the Dr. Silkworth's experience. So that's my doctor's opinions in the first part of the book, and Bill's story, which is step 1. And then we didn't like that. And then Ebby brought Bill a solution. He was aghast at that solution. They gave us a solution in chapter 2, and some of us were aghast too at that solution. So they told us some more about alcoholism, more about what might happen to us unless we accepted the solution that was described. And they knew that Bill had problems with that solution that was presented to him, and he knew that we were going to have problems with that solution too. So he gave us chapter 4 called We Agnostics. The word agnostic is very, very important to me. Gnostic means knowledge. Ag means without. Those of us who are without knowledge, which is the agnostic. That's what I was. I needed to have another understanding of the one that I had. So that's why I put chapter 4 there. And then on chapter 5, it begins how it works. that begin to tell you how it works. So we've covered the doctor's opinion in the first 4 chapters, basically looking at steps 1 and 2. And then it says chapter 5, into action. Now, it's not into thinking, it's into action. And action is a magic word in Alcoholics Anonymous. And once we have took the action steps, certain results happen. And we have a spiritual awakening as a result of those steps. So then we can start working with others. We can start carrying that message, the message of the first few chapters, to another alcoholic, helping them in turn learn the solution also. So the big book is laid out in a certain sequence to bring about certain ideas. And once we realize all those little chapters and why they're there, the book opens up and it becomes a very fascinating book.
Okay, now that we know a little something about the layout of the book, let's follow that a little further. Let's go to the preface now for just a few minutes. I've got we're dealing from a 3rd edition here, and it's Roman numeral 11. Some of you have got the 4th edition. Is it the same page? I think it is. I'm not sure. Is it Roman numeral 11? XI? Good. Okay. Let's go to the 2nd paragraph on that page. Because this book has become the basic text for our society and has helped such large numbers of alcoholic men and women to recovery, there exists a sentiment against any radical changes being made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume, describing the AA recovery program, has been left untouched in the course of revisions made for both the 2nd and the 3rd editions, and today, of course, the 4th edition too. I think there's 2 ideas we need to look at very briefly. Number 1, because this book has become the basic text for our society. All kind of books in the world today. You know, there's novels written on fact, novels written on fiction, biographies, autobiographies, concordances. We could name many, many different kind of books. But we all know what a textbook is. Some of us don't have very fond memories of textbooks, because we remember we had to use them in school.
Every time I think about a textbook, I think about cheating for some reason. I don't know why.
We had to read and study, which we didn't want to do, and we had to take tests and et cetera, which we didn't want to do. But if you look at a textbook in its simplest form, it is nothing more than a way or a means to transfer information from the mind of one human being or a group of human beings to the mind of another human being, thereby increasing the knowledge of the one who's using the textbook. And that's really all a textbook is for, is simply to transfer information through the written word from the mind of one group of people into the minds of another group of people. A textbook is, and by the way, that's what teaching is too. I hear a lot of people in AA today say, well, you can't teach. I don't know why not. Teaching is nothing more than transference of information from one mind to another. And a textbook is simply a tool that is used during the teaching process. If you look at a textbook, you'll notice that they're nearly always written in a certain sequence. They normally assume that the reader of the book will know very little about the subject matter. Usually starts at a very simple level. And then as the reader progresses through the book, his knowledge increases and the information presented becomes more difficult. Let's take a textbook on mathematics, for instance. Let's say my friend Joe here knows nothing at all about mathematics. He can't add, he can't subtract, he can't do any of those things. Oh, he can count okay. He could probably count to 21 if he's standing there naked and got everything where it belongs.
20 and a half, actually.
And I hand Joe a textbook on mathematics, and I say, I want you to go to chapter 5 and work the algebra problems. Well, being a good fellow, he'll go to chapter 5 and look at it, but he can't even add and subtract. That's just a bunch of scribbles on paper to him. Impossible situation. But if I say, Joe, this textbook on mathematics, chapter 1, deals with the value of numbers, addition and subtraction. Read it, study it, let me help you with it, ask questions when you need to. By the time you're through with chapter 1, you'll know how to add and subtract. And sure enough, he learns how to do that. And then I say, now you can go to chapter 2, and there you can learn how to multiply and divide. And he does that. And I say, now you go to chapter 3, and you can learn fractions and decimals, gradually preparing his mind for the algebra problems in Chapter 5. I think the greatest mistake I see being made in AA today with the big book is a newcomer comes in, somebody hands him a copy of the book and says, go to Chapter 5 and do what it says and you'll be okay. And they go to Chapter 5 and immediately they run into a series of algebra problems. Step 1 said we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. Our lives had become unmanageable. The newcomer said, man, I'm not powerless over anything. Step 2 said, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. Newcomer said, don't tell me I'm crazy. Yeah, I do stupid things when I'm drunk, but when I'm sober, I'm much like other people. Well, if you're not powerless and you're not nuts, then you don't need to be thinking about making a decision to turn your will and your life over to the care of something you don't understand in the first place. We present them with an impossible situation. If we can do nothing else all weekend, I hope we're going to be able to see the value of the doctor's opinion in the first 4 chapters, because they prepare our minds for Chapter 5. You see, Chapter 5 starts with Step 3, and it's very difficult to start on 3 unless you got 1 and 2 behind you. And unless you know what's in a doctor's opinion in the first 4 chapters, it's impossible to have 1 and 2 behind you. So hopefully we'll be able to see that. The other thing that is so important is there exists a sentiment against any radical changes being made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume, describing the AA recovery program, has been left untouched. And I think this is one of the greatest miracles of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know how we love to change things. And everybody that's ever read this book has rewritten it at least twice in their own minds, But collectively, we've never found it necessary to change the recovery section. In 1955, they decided the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous had changed so radically that they needed to put some different stories in the back of the book. More and more women were coming in. Bottom was becoming higher and higher. Age was coming down. So they came out with a second edition, deleted some of the original stories and added some new ones. Same thing happened in 1976 with the third edition. Same thing happened recently with the fourth edition. But the recovery section has never been changed since it was first produced in 1939. I wonder why. Anybody care to venture why? Hell, it works, doesn't it? It works just as good today as it did in 1939. Why does it work just as good today? People come to me today and they say, oh, Charlie, you're outdated. They say things have changed. You don't understand. Things aren't like they were in 1939. And my answer back to them, I say, you crazy as hell. I say alcoholics haven't changed. They're still doing the same thing today they did in 39. They get drunk. They get in car wrecks. They get in knife fights. They get in hospitals. They go to divorce courts. They get in penitentiaries. They're going to cemeteries. They're still doing the same fun things today they did in 1939. Alcoholics haven't changed a lick. Alcohol hasn't changed. The names have changed. The bottles have changed. The colors have changed. But alcohol itself is the same thing today it was in 1939. Human nature never changes. It's the same thing today as it was 2,000 years ago. Well, if alcoholics haven't changed, if alcohol hasn't changed, if human nature hasn't changed, then there's no necessity to change the program of recovery, because that's what our book really deals with. Alcoholics and alcohol and human nature works just as good today as it did in 1939. I think we need to be sure that we talk to the newcomers about these kind of things, to be sure that they understand this thing is not an outdated book. It still works today just like it did in 1939.
Let's go to the forward to the first edition. It said we, and that's the first and biggest word of all of Alcoholics Anonymous, we. We can do what I cannot do. We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. I'm going to take over, Charlie. Sorry.
Okay, 2 ideas here again. We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Most books I read have been authored by one person. And if I read something in the book that's authored by one person, And I don't agree with it. I just say to myself, well, who in the hell are they to think they're smarter than I am? And I disregard it. But if I do that with the Big Book Alcoholics Anonymous, I'm not going to be arguing with just one person. I'm going to be arguing with 100 people. The first 40 people in 1937 told Bill, we want you to write the book. They said, you've been sober longer than any of the rest of us. That was just a little over 3 years. And you know more about the program than the rest of us, so we want you to write the book. But they said, Bill, it's not to be your book, it's to be our book. And as you write those chapters, we want to see them. And we will add to, delete from, and change around whatever we think is necessary. When we're through with it, it'll be the collective knowledge, experience, and wisdom of all 40 of us. Well, by 1939, that 40 had changed to 100. So I've got to remember today, if I'm going to argue with this book, I'm going to be arguing with not one person, but with 100 people. And I'm going to be arguing with 100 people who have recovered from the same thing that's killing me, a hopeless state of mind and body known as alcoholism, which brings up the word recovered. You know, we hear fights going on about this word all over the country. The word recovered. They say, can you really recover from alcoholism? Apparently you can, because the Big Book says so. It says we have recovered from a hopeless condition of mind and body. You know, when I first came to AA, I lived in a hopeless condition of mind and body. I could not keep from taking a drink, nor could I drink safely. And my life became an absolute living hell. I came to AA, and I got the Big Book Alcoholics Anonymous, and I began to work the program, and I no longer live in that hopeless condition of mind and body. You know, I still can't safely drink alcohol. I will always have the physical allergy. I will always be powerless over alcohol because of that reason. Never be able to drink it. Drink it safely. But you know, by golly, today, I don't have to drink it. I don't live in that hopeless condition of mind and body any longer. I'll always be alcoholic, but I have recovered from alcoholism. And we're going to see this word recovered all the way through the book as we go through it. Another idea, to show alcoholics precisely how we have recovered, is the main purpose of this book. And if you'll notice, precisely how we have recovered is written in italics. I like to call that squiggly writing. And when you see squiggly writing in the Big Book, it's usually pretty important. Now, I know that you can't force anybody in AA to do anything they don't want to do. You know, you can come to an AA meeting today and you can say, I really don't like you people at all. I can't stand your damned old meetings, and I can hardly drink your lousy old coffee. But I'm going to be a member of AA because I've got a desire to stop drinking. And nobody can say anything about that. You can't force anybody in AA to do anything that they don't want to do. But we're not talking about being a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. We're talking about recovery from alcoholism. And there are certain things that we're going to have to do if we want to recover from that hopeless condition of mind and body known as alcoholism. And the Big Book has laid these things out for us in a very precise, specific, clear-cut set of directions. You know, it's kind of like making cake. Let's say we go to an AA potluck meeting, and you've made a good strawberry cake, and that happens to be my favorite, by the way. If you ever make me one, make it strawberry, please. And I bite into that cake, and it's just perfect. The texture's just right. The moisture content's just right. The taste is just right. And I say, who made this cake? And you being a good cook, you're probably going to say, well, I made it. And I'm going to say to you, then, would you tell me how you did so? And you're going to say, sure, I'll be glad to. And you sit down and you write out for me a precise set of directions on how to make that cake. Now, I take your directions home in my kitchen. And if I follow them precisely as you've laid them out, when that thing comes out of the oven and cools off and I bite into it, I think I can expect it to taste exactly like your cake tasted. But if I take your directions in my kitchen and my keen intellectual alcoholic mind begins to work. I may say to myself, well, I don't think it needs 3 cups of sugar. Surely 2 cups would be sufficient. Instead of half a dozen eggs, I'm going to put 8 eggs in it. Instead of baking it for 18 minutes, I'm going to bake it for 28 minutes. And that thing comes out of the oven and cools off and I bite into it. Sure, I'm going to be biting into a piece of cake. But I wonder how closely it would resemble your cake, which was my reason for making it in the first place. A precise, specific, clear-cut set of directions on how to recover from alcoholism. Okay. Now let's go over to the doctor's opinion. I hope Joe's all right. Hard for me to talk thinking about him out there doing whatever he's doing, but I think he'll be okay. Let's go with the doctor's opinion. In prior to the 1930s, most alcoholics didn't recover from alcoholism. You know, I don't think we really realize today how lucky we are to be living in a period of time where alcoholics are recovering from alcoholism in wholesale numbers. And I think one of the major reasons for the fact that hardly any of us ever recovered prior to 1930 was that they did not understand what alcoholism is. You know, prior to 1930, everybody thought that alcoholism is a matter of willpower, or they thought it was moral character, or they thought it was sin. Alcoholism is not anything new. It's been with us throughout the entire history of humankind. But the recovery from it is what's new. You know, you find even here in the United States that way, way back there was a fellow named Dr. Benjamin Rush. He was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And Dr. Benjamin Rush said alcoholism was an illness way back in those days. In fact, he wrote a paper on it. But he couldn't tell us what it was, and he never did really have an answer for it. He always said that the only answer he had was absolute abstinence, no drinking at all. There was a doctor in England some 450 years ago named Dr. Trotter, and he wrote a paper on alcoholism also. And he said it was an illness back then, but he had no answer for it. We go back through the recorded history of humankind and we find references to alcoholism as far back as we can find records. You know, you go into the Bible, which is one of the old recorded pieces of history, and you find references in the Bible to alcoholism. In fact, you go to Proverbs in the Bible, and Proverbs was written by a fellow named Solomon. And you all know Solomon was a very learned individual. People had a problem, they went to him to get the answer. He had lots of wisdom. And apparently somebody asked Solomon one time about alcoholism, and he describes it in Proverbs in the Bible. He says, "Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has redness of eyes? Who has wounds without cause? They that tarry long at the wine." Everybody was a wino in those days. They didn't have the hard stuff like we got it today. He said, "You will be as one who lieth down in the midst of a sea." You remember how you used to go to bed and that old bed start moving around on you when you lay down? Or sleepeth at the top of a tall mast. And he said, "You will say, they have beaten me and I felt it not." You remember how you used to get up in the morning, you got bruises all over you, and you don't remember where you came from? And he surely knew some of us men. He said, "And thine eyes will behold strange women." And their heart shall utter perverse things.
Yeah, like, trust me, honey, please.
But then he said the most meaningful thing of all. He said, "They will arise in the morning and seek it yet again." Almost a perfect description of alcoholism as we know it today. But he didn't have any answer for it either, because he didn't know what caused it. Dr. Silkworth came along. Silky was interested in alcoholics back during his days in medical school. He was always trying to work with alcoholics, even as a medical student. When he got out of medical school, he wanted to work with alcoholics. But in those days, back in the 1920s, it was very, very difficult for a doctor to make a living working with alcoholics. Alcoholics were very, very difficult to work with. Most doctors did not want to work with us then, and most of them don't want to work with us today. 2 or 3 reasons for that. They say, hell, alcoholics will never do what you tell them to do, and certainly we don't. And they say they'll lie to you all the time. They won't tell you the truth, and surely we don't. But then they say the real reason we don't want to work with them is they don't pay their bills, and that's the truth also. But for some reason, Silky had a real driving desire to be able to work with alcoholics, and he worked with us for several years, off and on. In 1929, when the big stock market crash came, and Silky, like everybody else, lost everything he had, including his job. And he was trying to find a job, and there was a fellow named Charlie Towns here in New York City that had a little hospital called the Towns Hospital. And he got Silky to go to work for him, working with alcoholics, paying him something like $30 a week, room and board. And Silky went to work here in 1930. And he worked with hundreds and hundreds of alcoholics before he ever ran into Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson came in the summer of 1933. And by that time, Silky had treated many alcoholics. And he had begun to develop his ideas about alcoholism. He sat down with Bill and he said, Bill, there's something different about you guys. He said, I'm not sure what it is. But he said, it seems to me as though that every time you try to drink, it seems to trigger some kind of craving in your body that makes it impossible for you to stop drinking after you've once started. He said, most people I work with aren't that way. But he said a certain percentage of you guys, maybe 1 out of 10, you just can't safely drink alcohol. And he said, I'm not sure, but he said, I'm going to call that a physical allergy to alcohol. And he said, because of that, you're never going to be able to safely drink again. Every time you try, you're going to end up drunk. And he said, also, I notice another thing peculiar about you people. He said, a lot of people I withdraw from alcohol, they say they're never going to take a drink again, and they leave here and they don't drink anymore. Or he said, some of them even learn to moderate and control their drinking. But he said, guys like you, it doesn't make any difference how badly you want to stop drinking. From time to time, your mind tells you that it's okay to take a drink. And thinking it's going to be all right, you take the drink, and then the allergy takes over, and then you end up drunk and sick and in all kinds of trouble. These ideas came from Dr. Silkworth. Prior to that time, nobody had any idea what alcoholism is, period. I don't think we really realize today the debt of gratitude that we owe to Dr. Silkworth. Because in the 1930s, the idea that alcoholism is an illness, the idea that it's a disease was not a very popular idea. And most people in the medical profession simply absolutely refused to look at it that way. And Silky had to go way out on a limb in order to be able to express these kind of statements. After Bill sobered up, after Bob sobered up, after the first 40 sobered up, they decided to write the big book. They went back to Dr. Silkworth. And they said, Doctor, this information you've given us about alcoholism is so important, we would like to put this in this book we're going to write. Do we have your permission to put it in there, and would you write some of it for us? And Dr. Silkworth said, yeah. He said, you got my permission, and I'll write some of it for you under one condition. He said, don't put my name in there. He said, if you do, they'll throw me out of the medical profession just sure as anything. The first edition of the big book, the first 16 printings, didn't have the doctor's name in it. It just had doctor's opinion, ... Now, when they came out with a second edition in 1955, the American Psychiatric Association, American Medical Association had recognized alcoholism as an illness, and Dr. Silkworth said, now you can put my name in it. From the second edition on, it has Dr. Silkworth in it. The first edition didn't have that in it. So let's look for a little bit about the doctor's opinion. And we're going to take a break here before very long, but let's look at a few ideas first. Joe?
Yesterday we were up at Bill's home, and there was the first original big book of Alcoholics Anonymous there on display. And on page 1 of that book, the doctor's opinion was on page 1. And for the next 16 printings, the doctor's opinion was on page 1. In 1955, when they made their first changes on the book, for some reason or other, we've never been able to find out how or why the doctor's opinion came off of page 1, went into the Roman numeral sections, and Bill's story became page 1. And we all know that the alcoholics don't read Roman numeral sections, do we? So we just skipped over that little portion of the book, the doctor's opinion. And really, truly, the doctor's opinion and the rest of the book is based on how to recover from the condition of the body and mind in which the doctor's opinion explains. And we don't understand what the problem is. What are we recovering from? See, I need to know what the problem was. I ran around in AA for a couple of years, and I'd become everything I detested in a human being. I used to stand in the back of the room there and look down at my feet, and I was ashamed. I was totally ashamed because I didn't know what the problem was, really. One time we were together in 1975 in a hotel room. We were looking at the doctor's opinion, and Charlie said, "This is not a matter of sin. It's not a matter of lack of willpower. It's not a matter of moral character." And my thought was, well, what the hell is it then? Well, then we began to look at it as an illness, a malady, an illness, as they called it, of the body and of the mind. And they separated the body, the physical part, from the mental part and discussed it in great detail. And then I understand what my problem was. See, I'd been trying to recover from a moral character issue, a no good, rotten SOB issue, which is the way I felt. And so I began to look at this a little differently. The doctor's opinion is very, very, very important. See, on Roman numeral page 24, it said, "The physician who at our request gave us this letter has been kind enough to enlarge upon his views in another statement which follows. In this statement, he confirms what we who have suffered alcoholic torture must believe." Now, there's no must in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous that I'm aware of. Nobody can tell you what you should do or shouldn't do. But there's a lot of must in this book, and there's one of them. We must believe that the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as his mind.
You know, this is the first time in written history we can find anywhere a reference to the fact that the body is quite as abnormal as his mind. All references to alcoholism before this dealt with the mind only. Weak will, moral character, sin, and etc. But here we see a statement that says the body is quite as abnormal as the mind. So it's really telling us two things. We are abnormal when it comes to alcohol with the mind. We're also abnormal when it comes to the body. And the first thing he's going to talk about is the body, the abnormality of the body.
We're going to separate the body, talk about it for a while, and we'll talk about the mind for a while. It did not satisfy us to be told that we could not control our drinking just because we were maladjusted from life, that we were in full flight from